see everyone here. I did not do remote checks, and there it is. Okay. Good to see everyone here this morning. Appreciate you being here all throughout the month of December. Our theme, we've been talking about Jesus coming into the world. And one thing that amazes me, and again, we're not looking at this from how we normally do. Normally we look at this time of year and we look at the fairy tale version of this story, or I like to call it the Disney-fied version of this story. And we tend to rely on the traditional telling of this story instead of the biblical text. And in doing so, one of two things happens. Either we just turn the story into a debate point, or we totally miss the point of the text and what's being taught. And so we've been looking at this story, and one thing that amazes me about this entire event, and I know there's a lot of debate about times and dating, all of these things, but when we just look at our calendar as a whole, our calendar today, our modern calendar, is divided into two halves. And what marks the tradition, or the transition from that first half to the last half is this event right here. We have everything over here that comes before Jesus came to the world. And then following, we have everything that happened after Jesus was born. This event was so monumental that the world and everything changed because Jesus had come. Everything has changed. And of course, we're talking about Jesus, but not just His birth. We're also talking about His reign. We're talking about His kingship. We're talking about His present reign over heaven and earth, and all of that good news. It brings us joy, and it should. It brings us joy, and it brings us gladness, and it brings us happiness, and all of those things are good. It's good for us to be joyful when we talk about Jesus. It's good for us to be glad when we talk about Jesus and when we think about Jesus and as we fix our eyes on Jesus. But I think sometimes we rush through so quickly. We rush through the message so quickly about Jesus, about this particular story about Jesus, that sometimes we forget that even though the coming of Jesus brings incredible joy and incredible gladness, that this story happens in the midst of grief. That this story happens in the midst of pain and turmoil. That this story happens in the midst of trauma and crisis. And when we look at this, it's supposed to teach us. It's supposed to teach us that this so very often, it's at these points where God meets us. God meets us so many times, not on top of the hilltops or on top of the mountains. He meets us most of the time in the valleys. God meets us in the midst of our pain and in the midst of our brokenness. And in the midst of our turmoil and crisis. And so many times the holidays just absolutely magnify those feelings, don't they? And so if you're in the middle of a crisis, if you're in the middle of a point in your life that and you're saying, hey, this isn't a hilltop for me, this is a valley. This is not a high point for me. This is a low point in life. This is one of the most difficult, or maybe one of the most challenging times of my life. Or maybe you're not saying that, but maybe you're saying, I'm remembering this low point. I'm reflecting back on this particular valley. I'm remembering and reflecting back on these difficult and trying and crisis-filled times in my life. And our encouragement this entire month, our encouragement is that turmoil, in that crisis, in that low point, actually puts you in the right frame of mind to see Jesus. And to see him maybe like you've never seen him before. And to understand him maybe like you've never understood him before. And to experience him maybe like you've never experienced him before. Because Jesus comes into the world, and it's not a world full of joy and happiness. It's not a world full of singing and enjoyment for everyone around him. He came into the middle of a very broken, very crisis-filled environment. And that's where we are again this morning. So let's take our Bibles and let's turn over to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, we're going to begin reading in verse 1. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, that all the world should be registered." This was the first registration when, don't you love these names? Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. So this kind of gives us an overall setting, doesn't it? So here is Luke telling us that everybody was going to be registered when Quirinius is the governor of Syria, and Caesar decrees. They get together, they decide that everybody needs to be registered. This is everyone throughout the Roman Empire. They're supposed to be registered, and they're supposed to participate in a census. Now, we can stop right here and try to think and reason some of these things out and just ask the question, why? Why would the Roman Empire, why would the governor, why would Caesar want everyone to register? Oh, why would they want everyone to participate in this particular census? And the surprise, which should not be a surprise, is that governments tend to be the same no matter what ideology they are. And the simple reason is one, isn't it? It's taxes. Taxes. It's so they could charge people taxes. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a first century Jew under the oppression of the Roman Empire. Here you are, living in this time, oppressed. Essentially, the Roman Empire has your people enslaved. And now here's the governor, here's Caesar, and they're saying, you have to travel. Now, when we think of having to travel for a government thing, maybe it's to Louisville, maybe down to Nashville, and so we get in our car, and we have to sit in the car, and we complain for 5 hours that we have to drive to Louisville, or we complain for 2.5 hours we have to drive to Nashville. But these are people who are having to travel on foot days. For days, they're having to travel. And all because, not to go to a game or to go have fun or attend a party, but all because the government wants them to register. And wants them to register so they can take their money. Now, Luke says that all went to be registered, and that's true. That is true. Everyone went to be registered. But the everyone here is everyone that Luke is talking about in his story. In Luke's story, in Luke's narrative here, everybody mentioned goes to be registered. But Luke knows, as well as the original audience would know, who would be reading this for the first time, that not everyone in Israel was quick to say, "You betcha, sure." In fact, not everyone would go along with this. There was a man by the name of Judas, and not the Judas we know. That was actually a common name back then. I have a feeling some notoriety caused it to cease from being a common name. But Judas the Galilean was this man's name, and he led a revolt. And he says, I'm not paying taxes. I'm not going to participate in any kind of census. In fact, Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, would write about Judas the Galilean. And according to Josephus, Judas the Galilean said that this taxation is no better than entering into more slavery and extorting a nation and preventing them from asserting their liberty. In fact, Judas was going around encouraging all of his other Jews up in Galilee to say no to this. Don't you dare do this. And if you do, you're nothing but a coward. If you even dare to pay tax to Rome, and it's just as if our God would submit to mortal men. That was Judas's mindset. And so anyone who would go, anyone who would participate in this census, who would participate in this registration, who would pay their taxes, who would go along with all the rules of Rome and Caesar, according to Judas the Galilean, they're all a bunch of cowards. He was saying, you can't give in to this. You can't give them your money. You can't pay your taxes. You can't go down and register. You can't participate in this census. And years later, a man by the name of Gamaliel would stand in front of the Sanhedrin. And he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he would stand in front of his peers and reflect on some of the people who would come along and lead revolts and try to start these revolutions. And in fact, Gamaliel, who was this teacher of the Jews, he was a famous rabbi, well-known rabbi of the time, he began to contrast Jesus and this new developing Jesus movement as they viewed it. And he would contrast these people over here with Judas the Galilean, who revolted and who said, I'm not going to pay my taxes. And this is what he had to say about him. This is from Acts chapter 5. Again, Luke's writing. Acts chapter 5 and verse 37. He says, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Now, the movement of Jesus and Jesus' leadership and the disciples of Jesus and those who were acknowledging his kingship, the sort of Messiah that Jesus is, Luke is showing us that he is in direct opposition. He is the direct opposite of a man like Judas the Galilean. The contrast is here to show us how the disciples of Jesus are completely different in mentality and thinking from individuals like Judas the Galilean. This, and the thing is, this is the sort of Messiah the Jews of the first century were looking for. This was the sort of individual they thought was going to come, someone who was going to come up and be like Judas the Galilean and say, hey, you don't go down and register, and you don't participate in this census, and you don't refuse to pay your taxes. What they did not expect was someone like Jesus to come along who was meek and gentle and lowly. So we keep reading as we set the scene, verse 4. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. Okay. Again, I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of Joseph now. In the shoes of Joseph. Let's think about what life was like for him and for Mary just for a minute. From Nazareth down to Bethlehem, you're looking at about a 4 days journey. 4 days, and it's through hills. It's not a flat journey. You're going up and down hills, all the hills of Judea, and you're on this 4 day journey. But here's what's remarkable, and here's what I really want us to notice. The lineage of Joseph. The lineage of Joseph. He was in the lineage of David. And that's the sole reason they were going down. They had to go back to their hometown to register, and he's going to the town of David because Joseph is in the lineage of David. And so that's why they're going down to Bethlehem. Now, before we move from that, notice what that means. Joseph is royalty. Joseph is royalty. he is a descendant of David. David was his great, I didn't really count, I'm guessing, great-grandfather. The point being, Joseph is in the lineage of David. He's royalty. But he's not royalty like we think of royalty, is he? Joseph doesn't have fancy clothes. Joseph isn't wearing a crown on his head. Joseph isn't traveling first class in a carriage pulled by horses. Joseph doesn't enter into a city or a room and have people bowing down at his feet. In fact, it's been centuries, hundreds of years, since the family of David had any kind of respect, had any kind of honor, had any kind of power. In fact, you could kind of think about this as sometimes we'll think about indigenous people. All throughout the world, at one time, maybe their tribe, for instance, they were the chiefs of their tribe, and they had all of this honor and respect, and their family had all of this power, but because of years of oppression and slavery and poverty, all of that has been taken away. And that's the kind of royalty Joseph and Mary are. Their royalty, they had royal blood. They were however many greats away from David. But after years of oppression, years of slavery, years of poverty, they're extremely poor people. But notice also, before we leave this part of the story, notice the meekness of Joseph. Joseph doesn't expect anyone to bow down at his feet. Joseph isn't like Judas the Galilean who is saying, hey, we're not going along with this census, and we're not going to pay our taxes, and we're not going to be registered. No, Joseph simply meekly goes where he is told to go, and he does what he is told to do. He is meekly obeying the orders of Rome. Look at verse 6. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now these two verses, we sort of have painted a certain picture in our minds in regard to the birth of Jesus, and we kind of have this picture, and it's more based on traditional retellings of the story than the text itself, and so we want to think about what it was like, these things, these events that transpired and led up to all of these different things. And so we get this picture in our mind right off of they're coming into Bethlehem, and it's the middle of the night. She is in labor already, about to give birth, but truly we don't know that was true. We simply don't know that was true in regard to the time frame. Maybe she was in labor when she came into the town. Maybe, but it could have also been weeks before she goes into labor when they arrive there. Maybe even months. And we simply don't know how long they had been in Bethlehem before the labor started. And we also don't know whether they traveled by themselves. That's normally, again, the picture that we have. Here's Mary on a donkey, and she's with Joseph, and they're traveling themselves. But more historically accurate, they would be traveling with family. They wouldn't be by themselves. And they would be traveling in some kind of a family caravan. But the word here in these verses that really gives us a very, very difficult idea of the situation is that word "in." And that's because we're placing our modern selves, our modern knowledge and culture back into the text, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do. When we think of inn, we think of a motel. Usually an inn, it is even relegated to us today maybe as one of the seedier motels. We think of a motel and a hotel, but an inn is the one where the doors face the outside, not a hallway, right? Where it's like, I don't know if I really want to stay here, that kind of is the picture that we get in our mind. But the inn here isn't necessarily that of a hotel or motel. That's not what we're talking about. The first century house usually had two levels. There was a bottom level where people would enter in and out, but the family lived in the top level. That's where they lived. That's where they stayed. And the bottom level was used as a place to keep animals warm at night. And so the more accurate picture of what we're getting here is more than likely a huge gathering of family has happened, and there's not enough room where the family gathers for Joseph and Mary to stay, and so they stay on the bottom floor. That is more than likely the historical picture of what we're seeing there. There's only room with them in that bottom floor where the family animals would reside and sleep in the night. But one way or another, here's the thing about all of these details. They don't really matter to the story. And this is why I say that. We get to focusing on these and we lose the main idea and the main focus. What matters here is that we see the poverty and the humility and the meekness of Jesus coming into the world. You see, this doesn't happen by accident. There's nothing in the Bible that's just happenstance. There's nothing in the Bible that's written by accident or coincidence. It is not an accident that God chose to bring His Son into a world, into this particular family. It wasn't an accident that God did not choose Judas the Galilean. It wasn't an accident that Joseph was chosen to be his earthly father, because they weren't rich. They weren't powerful. They were poor, and they were meek, and they were lowly. Because that's exactly the way Jesus would go on to live the rest of His life. In fact, His very own words, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay His head. This is the way Jesus would continue to live throughout the rest of His life, on the brink of or in poverty, in lowliness. And I want us to get this. I want us to get this morning, that rather than merely showering gifts from above, Christ personally took on poverty and chose the meek and the poor as His family. He could have just descended up on high. Christ could have just descended on high and just gave gifts to all the poor and the meek and the lowly. He could have stayed way up above and had a huge palace and whole lots of money and just showered gifts on all of the lowly peasants below. And that's what earthly kings do, don't they? Earthly kings, earthly leaders, they live way up on high. And they shower gifts on all of those down below, and they do so as they're looking down on them. And they do so condescendingly, and they just give them the gifts. But our Lord doesn't do that. Rather than showering gifts from above, Jesus takes on humanity. And not just puts on humanity, but Jesus puts on servanthood and poverty and meekness and lowliness. And so when Jesus goes out and He's talking about the poor, He's not talking about them. He's talking about us. This is His family. And that becomes extremely important. The Hebrew writer, decades later, would say that Jesus had to experience everything His brothers and sisters experienced so that He could be a faithful and merciful high priest. And that means Jesus experienced what you experienced. Your crisis is His crisis. Your pain is His pain. Your poverty is His poverty. Your feelings of rejection are His feelings of rejection. He knows what it feels like to be rejected and to have people look at Him in a suspicious manner and to be looked down upon and to be treated like a criminal just for existing. He knows what it is to go through whatever it is you are going through or have gone through or even will go through. He isn't a king who remains on high simply just showering gifts on all the lowly peasants. He is a king who says, I want to be present with you. And I want to experience everything that my people experience. And I want your pain to be my pain. And I want your hurt to be my hurt. And I want your crisis to be my crisis. And I want to live life in you and with you. And do we understand? Do we see the difference that makes? That our king isn't one who sits up in a palace and just showers gifts on people. That would be nice. It would be nice for a generous king to come along and be very benevolent and to give charity to us. And God certainly does give us gifts. But Jesus does so much more than that. He takes our poverty and our humility and our lowliness and our crisis and our turmoil and our struggle and our hurts and our tears, and He makes them His own. He lives in His people and with His people. Look at verse 8. And in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. Now, again, not ever living in the first century, we tend to have an issue with sometimes understanding what's happening and the time. But have you ever asked yourself, why shepherds? Have you ever asked that question? Why shepherds? I mean, it's not a coincidence. Nothing in Scripture is there as a coincidence or just accidental. There's a purpose. And what's very interesting about this, in all of the people in Judea, think of who God could have chosen. Here He is. He's letting His glory be known and to be seen. And He chose shepherds. You see, in the first century, shepherds were the lowliest of career paths. That was something that just anybody could do. It was something that did not really take a whole lot of effort to do. And most of the time it was very, very sedentary. And so shepherds tended to be the lowest in the hierarchy of people. Religious people looked at them and all they could see was the fact that they were always, because of their occupation, ceremonially unclean. Society in general deemed them untrustworthy. Other Jews would say, a shepherd? Whoa, don't go around them. You got to watch yourself when you're around them. You can't trust them. They'll take everything you have if you let them. But God chose these people. These people. And these are the people to whom He is going to manifest His glory. Now think in your mind what that might mean and look like in our culture. Who would that be in our culture? What career would that be in our culture? What kind of people? Where God says, these people. In order to show them everything that I'm about to do, it's going to be these people. In order to show them everything I'm going to be doing, it's going to be these people. The good news, this good news. I choose the people who are rejected. I choose the people that other people do not want to be around. I choose the people that everyone looks at as always being ceremonially unclean. I'm choosing the people that other people do not trust. Those are my people, and I'm going to manifest my glory to them. These are the guests at my party. Verse 10. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." Can you imagine the sight? Can you just picture that? We are seeing heaven and earth being merged together, coming together in this field outside of Bethlehem. And this merging of heaven and earth, as it was in the beginning, right here in the middle of this story, we're seeing a new day dawning, a new day breaking into the middle of the night. And it's coming in a world full of turmoil, where Caesar is pressing his thumb harder and harder on these oppressed Jewish people, and they're screaming out in pain and in agony, and in the middle of all of this, God breaks forth and his glory is manifested, and heaven and earth come together in this amazing show of the angelic hosts. And who gets a front row seat? The rich? The powerful? The religious elites? A bunch of shepherds out in the field. I want to read to you two quotes that I found. This is very interesting to help us get this picture of who these shepherds would have been. In one commentary, it reads, "Shepherding had changed from a family business as in David's time to a despised occupation." Another commentator says this: "The rabbis considered them to be religious outcasts, and their testimony was not admissible in court." And here is a bunch of shepherds that other people don't trust, a bunch of shepherds that other people don't like, a bunch of shepherds that no one wants to be around, and God says, "I want them to have a front row seat at the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a new age, the beginning of humanity. As I break into the world and my son becomes king, I want the lowliest of the lowly. I want the poorest of the poor. I want the people that are on the margins of society. I want them to have a front row seat at my party and to see God, what God is actually doing, what Jesus would later exemplify in his teachings to his disciples." Do you remember Luke 14? In Luke 14, beginning in verse 12, Jesus is teaching, and he said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." That's amazing, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? That God is breaking into the world, and God is changing everything, and God is establishing his kingdom with his values and his priorities, and he is setting an upside-down world right side up, and he wants the shepherds to have a front row seat. He wants shepherds to be the guests of honor at his party. And do we realize what that means for us? In the midst of your crisis, in the midst of your brokenness, in the midst of your lowliness, no matter what is going on, God wants you at his party. God wants you, and I don't care what anyone else says about you. It doesn't matter what Dad says, and it doesn't matter what Mom says, and it doesn't matter what your neighbors say. God says, if you will humble yourself before my Son, I want you at my party. Look at verse 15. When the angels went away from them into heaven, The shepherds said to one another, let us go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. And they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. Again, a manger. A manger, literally a horse trough. That's the bed for God's Son. Verse 17, and when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been told them concerning this child, and all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen as it had been told them. Glorifying and praising God. I couldn't help but ask the question, reading through this, what was it that changed for them? What aspect of life changed for them? I mean, here are these shepherds. Now what are they going to do? They're going to go back to their field, and they're going to go back with the sheep, and they're going to watch the sheep. But what are people now going to be saying about them? Oh, those are the shepherds over there. You need to stay away from them. But not only you need to stay away from them, now you don't want that much to do with them, especially now because they're talking crazy stuff now. They're saying all kinds of weird stories about something that happened the other night. And people still will dislike them, and people still will distrust them, and people still will despise them. But God had met them where they are. You see, this story is all about the glory and the grime. It's all about the divine and the dirt. It's all about the majesty and the mud. And that's where God met them. So what's changed for them? It's not their career. Their career didn't change. It's not their livelihood. Their livelihood isn't going to change. Economic status, absolutely the same. Whether or not people liked them or trusted them, it's not going to change. So what's changed for them? Truthfully, everything. Everything has changed. There's no way that these shepherds could be the same people they were before. And once they see this event, because everything had changed, because God had taken up His presence with them. God had given them His presence. They had experienced the presence of God. And isn't that what the gospel teaches us? This is what we need to come away with for this week. The gospel teaches us that hurting people need presence more than gifts. Hurting people need presence more than gifts. In your pain and in your struggle and in your crisis, it would be nice if the situation would change. It would be nice if some gift was given that could change your situation and change your status, and that would be great and that would be wonderful, but God gives you something better, even more better, and that is His presence. And do we actually recognize that? That Jesus is present here now? That Jesus is present here? That Jesus is present in you if you belong to Him and you've been united with Him in baptism and you've given your life to Him, then Jesus is present with you everywhere you go and everywhere you are. And every time you cry a tear, and every time you feel lonely, and every time you feel grieved, and every time you feel whatever, Jesus is there, and Jesus is interceding on your behalf faithfully and mercifully as your high priest, and saying to you like no one else can say to you, I know your pain, and your pain is my pain, and in your pain I give you my presence, and presence is worth more than gifts. Church, that changes the way we interact with people around us as well. That hurting people need presence more than gifts. And there are hurting people all around us. There are people in your life and in your neighborhood and in your family and in this congregation who are hurting, and it's good to give them gifts. It's good to write a nice note or send a nice text. It's great to give a call or even a Christmas gift. All that is fine. It's good. It's wonderful. But what they really need is presence. They need you to do for them just what Jesus has done for you. To be present with them so that their burdens can become your burdens. And their pain becomes your pain. And their experience becomes your experience. And their hurt becomes your hurt. And their heartache becomes your heartache. And their turmoil becomes your turmoil. And their trials become your trials. And their crisis become yours. Because that's what it looks like to be a family. And that's what Jesus has done for us. He's adopted us into His family, and He has given us His presence and taught us to do the same for one another. And so when we're talking about the hurting, and we're talking about the poor, and we're talking about people who are going through trials, it's not them over there. We're talking about us. And if we personally aren't experiencing that trial or that crisis, we're then going to be present with those who are so that we can bear one another's burdens. This is where the gospel lives. The gospel lives where glory meets grime, where divine meets dirt, where majesty meets mud. This is where we live as disciples of Jesus, getting down in the grime and getting down in the dirt and getting down in the mud with each other, being present with each other. And so that's our encouragement for the week. Find someone, whether in your family, maybe in the church family, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe someone you work with, you go to school with, and just be present for them. Do for them what Jesus has done for you. Give them the gift of your presence. And if you're not a child of God, if you're not a disciple of Jesus, then become one. Put Jesus on in baptism so that He can give you, in the midst of everything you're going through, the gift of His presence. And if we can be there for you, if we can be present with you right now, the only way we can know how we can be present for you, with you, what your pains are, what your hurts are, the only way we can know is if you share them with us. And so we offer this invitation. We want to be present with you. If you need to put on Jesus in baptism, we want to help you. And if you need us to be present with you and pray for you and with you, make this invitation yours right now. Together we stand and sing.
Take my life and let